John Palmer, more commonly recognized by his nickname Goldfinger, rose to infamy as a notorious criminal and a central figure in the world of organized crime in Britain. This video aims to explore his life, understand his criminal activities, powerful influence, and the impact that he had on the criminal landscape within Britain. To comprehend how Palmer managed to wield and possess the power and influence that he had, it is wise to understand what his younger years were like and the challenges that he faced which ultimately pulled him toward criminality. John Palmer was born and raised in the market town of Solihull in 1950. His family were reportedly poor, unable to afford basic necessities. Not having access to food, suitable clothing or hygiene products must have been awful. As a result of his family being poor, Palmer was forced to attend school wearing cheap clothing and he was routinely mocked by his peers, with them calling him Stinky Palmer. Palmer would wear bags on his feet to prevent kids from seeing the holes in his plimsolls and he had a habit of wetting himself whilst in the classroom. Sure, John was teased at school but mostly he was left alone. John's older brothers looked out for him. John was reportedly proud of his hard upbringing but I'm sure that this teasing had him introspecting on his situation, wanting to get money by any means possible to avoid feeling powerless around other people. It should come as no surprise that Palmer drifted toward criminal activity as a child and both his school and home life sucked. His home environment was rough and unforgiving, with his father having abandoned the family when John was 5. Without support from a male breadwinner or the government, the mother tried her best to feed 7 children, all of which resided in cramped living conditions. The situation was so dire to the point whereby the family goldfish froze at Christmas because the home was that cold. Palmer's mother said that he is from French traveler stock. Somehow he will always find a way to come up on top. She was right. Palmer began thieving and at age 14, he was basically a rag and bone man, going from house to house buying and eventually flipping profitable items. Even with legitimate ventures, he was always open to involving himself in criminal activities to earn a buck. He was reportedly dyslexic and this played a role in him being unable to read, write or even count by the time that he left school at age 15. Palmer was involved in criminal activity but was capable of running his own legitimate businesses. At his core he was an entrepreneur. Like many young men, he had a burning desire to become something greater and made the move to Bedminster in Bristol. Having first arrived with his brother when he was 17, Palmer quickly fell in love with the city. He began flogging items in pubs and at the local market and he knew how to keep the money flowing. At some point, he managed to start up a gold and jewellery business. This was called Scadlan Limited. At age 20, he made his first £100,000. From the outside looking in, Palmer was truly making it and his story was truly one of rags to riches. However, Palmer was just as much of a criminal as he was a businessman. He didn't care about the karmic punishment which comes from crime and was eager to make money, regardless of the legitimacy or morality involved in obtaining it. John Palmer met his future wife in a Bristol nightclub in 1972. He won her over with his gold Jaguar E-Type. By 1975, Palmer had married this woman and was living in a mansion in South Gloucestershire. The couple had 2 daughters. His wife remembered John as being a good man but also recalled sketchy events while spending time with him. Incidents have John scamming people, selling them cars which turned out to be missing important parts. He'd even given his wife a car in which the gear stick fell off whilst she did a 3-point turn. More sinister events have John pressuring his wife to participate in a threesome with his brothers whilst on a weekend away in Torquay, Devon. Despite occasional friction within the marriage, for the most part everything was chilled out. Palmer was by now 25 years old and had already experienced many highs and lows in his life. As mentioned, Palmer was grateful of everything that he'd endured as a youngster. The pain of having nothing was no longer an issue as he was doing well financially. He still loved money obsessively, once saying, "I love the way it smells." Plus, he was still running Scadlan Limited. By this stage, John Palmer owned horses and a donkey. He was living the high life. As his business grew by the day, John decided to build an industrial-sized smelter in his back garden, right next to his horse stable. His keen eye for profit and scrap expertise from years past had now paid off and Palmer knew that pieces of old gold could be turned into valuable pieces of jewelry. John built the smelter in a couple of days and through trial and error, he perfected the art of smelting. At this time, Scadlan Limited had a turnover of £4 million and John had spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on a newspaper campaign. This campaign requested unwanted jewelry for cash. Reputation spreads and John Palmer was by now a well-known and reputed jewelry trader across Britain. Him and his wife bought a massive property near to Bath. They eventually owned 33 acres of land, with the property having everything that a rich couple could ask for. They had a pool, 8 horse stables and even their own woodland and lake. Even with all of these extravagant things, John was more interested in refitting the smelter into his new place. The smelter was placed into full view of people walking by the property, and criminals who knew of John Palmer were now very interested in reaching out to him so that they could put it to use. The Brinks Mat robbery was supposed to have been a quick 20-minute job. In reality, one of the gang members involved had slept in by 10 minutes, which delayed the heist. A number of unexpected factors meant that the raid took 2 hours to complete. An experienced criminal gang broke into a warehouse. They doused guards with kerosene and threatened to light them on fire if they didn't do as they asked. A vault inside the warehouse was opened, and the gang were amazed by what lay in front of them. They were expecting £3 million in cash. Instead, they came face to face with 6,800 gold bars, with these bars being the same size as a Mars chocolate bar. Without thinking about the major ramifications that would come with taking all of this gold, the gang said F it and took the lot. You can't blame them for doing this, but overall, the plan had been relatively chaotic and intel had been wrong from the start. The gang attracted police attention when they managed to spend some of the cash earned from the gold. They weren't savvy with the money and ended up buying properties in Canton, Essex. One of the gang members even purchased 2 Rottweilers, calling them Brinks and Mat. Without a doubt, the criminals were doomed from the start, and their recklessness with spending came back to haunt them. The robbery attracted global attention, and even with the gold bars being small, they were hot and would need to be melted down in order to erase serial numbers ingrained on them. It later came out that the gang turned toward a notorious British criminal named Kenneth Noy in order to fence the gold. Through contacts in criminal and legitimate circles, John Palmer's name was eventually brought to the attention of Noy. Noy reached out to Scadlan Limited. He had scrap gold to get rid of. Within a short space of time, bars were being sent to Palmer, who was melting them down and erasing the serial numbers. It isn't clear if Palmer initially knew that he was handling the Brinks Mat gold, but I'm sure that he wasn't too concerned. He knew what he was doing and was by now a master at using his smelter. To this day, 70% of the gold has yet to be recovered. John Palmer would eventually be tied to the Brinks Mat robbery. His involvement in getting rid of the gold made him a police target. The SAS raided his house at 6 a.m. and police arrested a couple who were house-sitting for John and his wife. Palmer and his wife were abroad and had been in Tenerife, lapsing up the sun, when they were made aware of police attempts to seize their assets. Police seized cars, 1 gold piece and Kenneth Noy's phone number from Palmer's home. Likely planted by police, the handwriting of the number didn't match to Palmer or Noy. They knew that Palmer and Noy had been involved in the later stages and wanted them bad. Around this same time, Noy stabbed an undercover officer in his garden and later beat the case. This added fuel to the fire and police focused resources toward Noy. Although they didn't really know one another, Palmer's name was linked to Noy, and this further tied him toward the case, making him an enemy in the eyes of the police. In reality, Palmer's Scadlan Limited business partner was more close to Noy. Living in the UK was now way too risky for Palmer. Him and his wife settled in Tenerife. Back home, police were freezing his assets and still wanted to interview him about Brinks Mat. Wanting a way to make money, Palmer got back to entrepreneurship. It was in Spain that Palmer first learned about timeshares. Palmer became obsessed with timeshares and began involving regular British holidaymakers. He was never interested in filing paperwork or documents, but his salesman tactics worked wonders in Playas de las Americas, a resort in Tenerife. Furthermore, he learned Spanish and bought a van to drive around so that he could form contacts. His face had been plastered in the media, associated with Brinks Mat, and he was nicknamed Goldfinger. Surprisingly, this actually benefited Palmer. People assumed that John was richer than he actually was, because of Brinks Mat. The Costa del Sol has always been a hub for British criminals, fleeing the clutches of the law. Police were trying to extradite Palmer, but to no avail. Palmer's wife returned to the UK but wasn't arrested. Palmer was the main target. New extradition laws led to Palmer being sent back to Britain. He'd fled to Brazil, but upon landing, he was apprehended. He was then sent back to the UK on July 2nd. Residing in Wormwood Scrubs, John was kept in solitary because he was deemed an escape risk. The gang involved in Brinks Mat had now been found guilty, including Kenneth Noy. He had beaten the murder of a detective on the grounds of self-defense, and a conviction of some kind was guaranteed. Upon being given a 14-year sentence, he told the jurors that he hopes that they all die from cancer. Palmer got lucky, and despite spending time behind bars, he was acquitted of any involvement. He thanked the jury but flipped off the police, undoubtedly further angering them and continuing the never-ending, bitter relationship. Throughout the 1990s, John Palmer continued to live in Spain and made big moves. He wasn't a fan of his nickname Goldfinger but used it to his advantage in order to rake in the money. With a 100-strong sales team, Palmer was flogging properties to Brits faster than construction crews were building them. Investors were essentially informed that getting in early was the key because prices were soon to reach the moon. He also returned to Britain to see his wife and obtained plane licenses, owning a helicopter and later private jets, which were stored at his hangar at Bristol Airport. The media dubbed Palmer Britain's richest gangster. With a reported net worth of £300 million, Palmer was supposedly richer than the Queen of England. It should be noted that the accuracy of this bold statement isn't known because the media love a good headline. In the late 90s and early 2000s, John Palmer was noticing that many people involved with the Brinks Mat job were being whacked. Known as the Brinks Mat curse, men involved with moving money were being gunned down, either in Spain or the UK. The Metropolitan Police informed Palmer that there was money on his head. Targeted for 8 counts of timeshare fraud worth £15 million, Palmer flew back to the UK on his private jet so that he could turn himself in. He was back in Tenerife the next day because his bail restrictions granted him this power. It took some time, but eventually Palmer went on trial for swindling British holidaymakers out of their money in Spain. Most of the victims were elderly British people, who simply wanted a place in the sun. In total there were 16,500 victims who purchased holiday homes in Tenerife. By this time, John Palmer was living with his new love interest in Essex and wasn't looking to plead guilty to the timeshare fraud charges. Prosecutors alleged that Palmer had made around £30 million from 13 Tenerife resorts that he owned. In court, John was sentenced to 8 years in Category A prison. He was moved from prison to prison because authorities believed that he might try to escape. To make matters worse, the British Crown had a confiscation order for £33 million of his assets. Moreover, victims from his timeshare scam wanted millions in compensation. Honestly, Palmer must have been fuming because his outside world life was collapsing. Even one of his former ex-lovers finessed him. Palmer was forced to pay this woman £70,000 per year. John Palmer was freshly home from prison and was now bankrupt. His name had been flushed down the toilet, but he still had some energy to at least pick himself up from all of the lows of life. As the years wore on, Palmer decided that it was best to get out of the timeshare business in Spain. People whom he had known had been whacked by assassins, with the killers leaving hundreds of grand's worth of jewelry on their tortured bodies. Nobody was safe, and Palmer was up against more violent criminals than himself, along with Spanish and British police agencies. John was eventually arrested by Spanish police and spent 3.5 years within the Spanish jail system. Palmer moved in with his new partner in Essex, and his wife wanted a divorce, which John wasn't willing to accept. He was very much isolated now and was pessimistic about life. The years of police raids and overall misery was now proving overwhelming. Perhaps it was his upbringing that suddenly sparked some optimism in his mindset, because Palmer rejoined the jewelry and gold business. Unfortunately for Palmer, he never reached his original successful heights. Palmer would be gunned down by a hitman at his house in Essex. A hole had been cut in a fence, which allowed the hitman to monitor John's movements. As John burned paperwork in a fire at the bottom of his garden, the gunman, armed with an 8mm pistol and silencer, shot Palmer 6 times in his chest and back. To this day, the 2015 murder is unsolved. John Palmer's life was one of extreme highs and lows. He had achieved much wealth and lived an insane life, filled with legitimate and illegitimate ventures. Ultimately, he paid the price for living a criminal lifestyle. He had been told that people had wanted him gone for years, and finally, someone had made it happen. The police argued that there were 16,000 motives investigated. A ton of people could be involved, or at the very least, put in the frame. One such explanation for his death involved Brinks Mat gold having been stolen from a safety deposit box during the 2015 Hatton Garden robbery. Palmer was said to have had money or stashed Brinks Mat gold in a deposit box. But that's a case for another day.